Okay, Grandpa, why don't you tell us about your experiences in Boy Scouting?
Well, when I was about 12 or 13, that would be about 1918, 19, just after the First World War, we had a Englishman in Far West that had had some military training, and they put him in as the one to direct the scouting in our ward. And it was all a drill, and I can remember so well of his English terms: right wheel, left wheel. And we didn't really have a full program, but that was pretty well in the starting when the church started scouting. And as young boys, both Leroy and I were involved, and we got a feeling of the scouting program right almost in the beginning. You see, that would be, scouting was celebrating their 75th year this year. That would have been 65 years ago anyway. And we had a good time with games and programs, but as I said, this one scout leader was pretty well an English military man, and I thought at the time that scouting was kind of a disciplined type of activity, and it didn't have the merit badges. I didn't know about merit badges or advancing to start out with. But it's been a big thing in our lives with our boys, and I felt glad that we did have that early experience of feeling good about scouting being a program for boys.
Well, the Blairs want to know about some of your favorite teachers when you were growing up.
Would you like me to speak first on that?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I can understand why the Blairs would be interested in that, being such great teachers themselves. They're kind of naturally that way. We thought, we'd listen to Dale do his teaching, and of course Bob and Judah and Lisa, they're all teachers. Well, as I look back, I've had several really wonderful teachers. I suppose the one that comes to my mind first is our first grade teacher. And I think the thing that made her outstanding was that the children really felt she loved them. And you know, that made us just happy to look forward to all of our future education. She was a beautiful young lady, never married. Her name was Hermes Peterson. She became very prominent there at the BYU later, just in education. Let me just mention one thing. I was telling my mother when I was a little older and able to understand better how much I loved Miss Peterson. All the children did. And how she loved the children. And my mother said, you know, Jennie, Miss Peterson at one time was engaged to be married and so happy and wonderful. But shortly before the marriage, the man she was going to marry told her that he absolutely would have no children. They could have a happy life, but he didn't want to have any children. She was so shocked and so distressed because she knew it was right to have the children. So she just broke it off immediately and refused it and never did marry. I don't know what happened to him. But then Mother made this interesting remark. She said, but you know, Jennie, I wish she'd have married him and had her children. And he would have loved them. I don't know, but I just said that. I suppose we think of all the great teachers at BYU, and I really had some great ones. But back when I was in about, I don't think we may have started junior high. It may have been 7th grade, or it may have been 6th. I think probably 7th. We had a young lady by the name of Olga Wunderlich come to Utah to Provo from Switzerland. And she spoke, of course she spoke French. That was her, she lived on the French border, and that was her natural language. She too was a beautiful woman and a loving, kind, intelligent person. But she taught us children, anyone who was interested, stayed after school. I don't know whether it was every day for an hour or 3 or 4 days a week. But I was one of the most fortunate ones. She had a very unique way of teaching us to speak French. She just wouldn't speak any English at all from the first day. She'd just go over and say, "Voici la table." This is the table, and she'd say it in French. When we got that, she'd go, "Voici la salle," so on. But I remember several times Miss Wunderlich was asked to take her little group of really children and demonstrate how they spoke French to the university French classes, because we had such a, really we were better than they were. Association, just, she was so natural in it. I remember her very well.
You know, I had an experience in New York. I met the boat coming in from Europe, and there was a young man by the name of Wunderlich.
Oh, yeah.
I met him and took care of him, getting him ready to come down to Utah. And then he used to write, and I noticed for the hymns and the songs, and I imagine he was a brother to,
No,
or maybe it was,
what was his name, John?
yeah, Gene,
That was his brother.
John Wunderlich. Yeah, I remember when he got off the boat, and he was so thrilled and kind of awe-stricken with it was down to the Hoboken Harbor. And I often, as I read about him, I thought about meeting him when he first came in.
Huh. It's a small world. Grandpa, do you have a favorite teacher that you remember?
Well, I remember starting school, and we had just one teacher in the whole group.
All the grades?
All the grades. And,
in one room? Or?
In one room. And I remember getting sick and having to quit school, and having this teacher come and tell me something about what was going on in school. But I guess the teacher that I remember best, and in the early grades anyway, was Douglas Bryan. He was a young man that was related to some of the people in the ward, but he hadn't lived there, and he moved in. And he used to sing, and he used to have us sing, and he would get out in the activities with us. And I actually have a picture of our graduation from the 8th grade, and he made that such a real event. We had diplomas, and we dressed up, and we had our picture taken. And I don't know whether it was a kind of a suggestion that may be the end of our education or not, but it was sure a big event when we graduated from the 8th grade, and Douglas Bryan was our teacher.
Great to have teachers that make such an influence.
Now you mentioned something about if I still remembered a little French.
Oh, yeah. You tell us some of what you remember.
You know, I really became quite fluent in French. That's been many years ago. But I know when I went over, after Mary completed her mission, Mary and I were traveling a little in Europe, and on one occasion, we had quite a journey to take, and I can't remember which country. It wasn't France. But anyway, we sat by a woman who spoke only French. And Mary spent that whole period, 2 or 3 hours traveling, talking to that woman in French about the gospel. I could follow along, but I wasn't as fluent. I had been in the past, you know, but I was so happy that Mary was so good about that. But I can still understand somewhat, you know, and Nancy asked if I just say a tiny bit, if I could possibly remember, and I'll just put a little bit for the sake of the record. But if I were saying to Nancy, Bonjour, mademoiselle, no, c'est Madame Nancy Tingey. Ce bon matin, je suis si heureuse que vous avez lost dans cette maison chez nous. Et je dis à vous, comment allez-vous ce bon matin? Et vous répondez, c'est un bel matin. Je suis très heureuse que vous et mon petit fille Joseph. Oh, c'est un beau petite fille.
Mama
Je
really,
vous aime very much.
Mama really did well when we were touring in French, and especially in France. She didn't speak very well, but I remember when the war, First World War was over, and some of the soldiers had learned a little French, and it reminded me of a story that they told about one of the doughboys had given the clerk $5 for just buying a pop or something, and hadn't given him the right change back, and he was arguing and speaking in English, and the Frenchman was just couldn't understand, and called another soldier in, and he says, "Can you speak French?" This other soldier says, "Oui," and he came in and he says, "Well," I told him what had happened, and this other soldier says, "Oui, oui, monsieur," and the clerk says, "Oui, oui," and then the soldier says, "Then why don't you give this man his right change?"
I think you put another emphasis in it, Grandpa, that you don't repeat.
But a little language was what they learned, just
Yeah.
a little bit.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you remember about the first cars and airplanes and Charles Lindbergh and that part of history?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about Charles Lindbergh. I happened to be in New York, and they just had the biggest celebration I'd ever seen, and what we called the ticker tape parade, and those big skyscrapers along 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, and that's where we went to see the parade. Those big buildings were just like Christmas trees almost, with banners and ticker tape going the whole street, and Lindbergh and a car going along. This would have been in 1925 or 6 anyway. I remember probably this 26, early in 26. But I remember too the story that Boss Kittering is supposed to have told about someone coming to him, and he was the head of General Motors, and a very outstanding man and a sort of a philosopher too. And they said, "Isn't it remarkable that Charles Lindbergh could fly across the Atlantic and do it all alone?" And Boss Kittering said, "It was remarkable, but I would have thought it much more remarkable if it had been done by a committee of more than one.
True politician.
But it was really just an event that caused more excitement than almost anything. In fact, I think they said that it was one of the biggest ticker tape parades that they had even bigger than at the end of the war.
Huh.
And now the automobiles, first one that we had on the farm, Uncle Charlie bought a truck, and it was called a chain drive with hard tires. It was kind of a combination between a tractor and an automobile, but it had a flat bed on, and then it had a little cab that you sit in. But instead of having a differential and a drive underneath, it had chains like on a bicycle, and those chains would pull the wheels, and instead of having inflated tires, it had hard rubber tires, and I always thought it was a great vehicle because it would go so much faster than horse and buggy. But I remember one time we would sit on the flat bed and with just kind of cushions, and the kids along the side of the road. I remember one day I really thought we were pretty smart, but I heard these kids say, "What a funny automobile, what a funny vehicle." And I got to wondering if it really was kind of funny. But to us, it was the first car that Uncle Charlie had, and the first one that we really had to do with. You cranked it, and you operated it with pedals, and we didn't have any blowouts because the tires were just hard rubber tires. And the first real automobile ride that I had that I remember was at the time Father died, and the doctor asked if he could take Roy and I for a ride, and he had an automobile, and we rode from farm home out to the Utah Hot Springs and back, and it really seemed like a miracle to me that it was an enclosed car. It was really easy riding, and I thought that was something that was sure remarkable and wonderful. And that would have been, you see, in 1909. I guess if you had one of those 1909 cars, it would be something remarkable.
That when they first came out, about 1909.
Well, they'd come out, there'd been some in 1906, I think. There was quite and there'd been some before, these horseless carriage type of thing. But this was one of the first. You see, I would have been, just 3 years old, so I wouldn't have known about any earlier than that. But I would say that was one of the early type of enclosed cars.
How about you, Grandma? What do you remember about some of those things?
That's interesting when I think of my father's first car, the old Model T Ford, and now we'd get out and crank it and crank it. Of course, Father had to, we couldn't do it. And the roads, they weren't like they are today. They were just up and down, and the excitement of it all. But I remember 2 years younger than Grandpa. I remember when Uncle Will Knight and one of his partners bought a great, huge Pierce Arrow. That caused excitement in the whole city of Provo because it was so different and so special. And you'd have to step up onto one step and then another to get inside. Of course, in those days, they didn't seem to have they weren't really closed in. They had some kind of protection, but it wasn't enough. And I know that Aunt Jennie, Uncle Bill's wife, and Uncle Bill, I'm sure, too, when they go on their little journeys in that big, wonderful car, they'd always wear a duster, so a hat, and a full coat, and something over their face, because otherwise it was pretty hard to take with the wind blowing in.
Dust and
Yeah. But they spent so much time just showing people, inviting them to take a little ride around the two
it
blocks.
was a really adventure.
Oh, I tell you, that car, I think even at that time cost $2,000 or $3,000. So it was quite a special thing.
What about Charles Lindbergh? Do you remember anything
Yes,
of
I
his
remember.
life?
I'm sure anyone alive at that time would remember that. Really, Daddy hasn't oversaid it at all. When we heard about it, we had just concluded the afternoon session of General Conference and came outside, and they announced it over a loudspeaker some way. People just on the tabernacle grounds, not inside the tabernacle, they just really did go wild. And I remember not too long after that how the whole country responded in shock and in sympathy when the little Lindbergh child, I don't know that you're even aware that it was kidnapped and actually killed. It was a long time before it was discovered, and they passed what they call the Lindbergh kidnapping law, death penalty. I remember we were all grieving over that. I remember that so well, that tragedy. And of course, Mrs. Lindbergh was a great character and has written some wonderful books, at least one I know.
You know, I've often thought about the connection between President J. Reuben Clark and the Lindbergh. I don't know whether I've read much about it, but Anne Morrow Lindbergh was the daughter of the ambassador to Mexico.
That's right.
And J. Reuben Clark was his assistant, and I've heard that Ambassador Morrow said that he could handle the job of ambassador to Mexico if he could have J. Reuben Clark as his first assistant, and then of course J. Reuben Clark succeeded Morrow as the ambassador to Mexico. So he would have surely been close to the Lindbergh family.
That's interesting. Why don't you take a minute and tell us about your grandparents, what you remember about your grandparents?
You started, Grandma. You had the, it seemed like there was grandparents everywhere around your place.
Well, I'll tell you, our grandparents were a vital, important, and very much loved part of our life. My father's parents had really moved to Salt Lake when I became old enough to be aware of them. But going to Salt Lake and visiting with Grandpa and Grandma Holbrook was always a great event in our lives. They had a big, beautiful home. They were quite prominent there. I know they did live in Provo prior to that. They had lived first in Fillmore, Utah, and then moved to Provo so the children could get good education at the BYU. And Grandfather Holbrook, of course, I've heard about this. I don't remember, I suppose even lie then, but he was the counselor in the state presidency for many years. That's where they used to do it. And he was also on the board of trustees of the BYU. And he was also mayor of Provo for a while, a couple of terms, I think. And there's really quite a great story about his contributions and his character. But I know as he worked with my grandfather Brimhall, who was president of the Brigham Young University, I used to say I was born and raised at the BYU in Provo. It was pretty much a lot of that. But maybe it would be good for the record to tell this little experience of Harold R. Clark, who's been gone for many years, but when he was still on campus, if any of the descendants have been aware of the Harold R. Clark building on campus, he was quite a friend of the family. He even spoke at my sister's, Rachel's, funeral. But I know that one Brother Clark, I was just walking across campus, and he caught up with me and said he wanted to tell me something. He knew he'd called me Miss Holbrook. And he said, you know, I knew your grandfather very well. This is, of course, when I was in college, and my grandparents, let's see, they were still alive and moved. But he said, I remember him so well when he lived here in Provo, and a great and wonderful example he was. And he said, I just want to tell you that he was known as being such an honest man that he outdid Abe Lincoln. And he said people actually used to kind of smile at him because he would go so far, you know, right to the nickel. And oh, I could tell you some beautiful stories that my father told me about what it cost my grandfather in some of these big enterprises to keep his honor just totally unsullied from what others didn't quite do that. But I remember that Harold R. Clark said to me, you know, Miss Holbrook, your father is exactly like him. He's so honest that people kind of smile at him at times. But then he says, and you know, before we leave, I want to tell you that I hope every one of their descendants is exactly like that. So honest that people really laugh at them. And that really was something I've remembered all my life. That's a great thing, you know, to have that kind of heritage come down to you. You're just determined to do, well, of course, never thought about anything else, but still, that's quite special. And of course, Grandfather Brimhall. Shall I relate that little story about when Vera was, I think it was when my sister Vera was born. I think generally women in those days had their babies at home. And we lived in the clinker brick house on 3rd East and 3rd North in Provo. My grandfather Brimhall lived just 2 blocks from us, but he was so close to my mother and used to come there so often, especially on occasions like this. And he was there. Mother was in labor and going to have her baby, and the doctor was there. And I can remember that when the baby was born, we were so relieved. And he came out of the bedroom. We could hear the little baby cry, and we were sure it all was well. But instead of kind of congratulating, he said, oh, it's another girl, say, that's my father. Isn't that a shame? He says, here you want as much to be a farmer, another girl. And he says, I did the best I could, but here it is. And I can remember, I was kind of surprised at all this conversation. But I remember Grandfather Brimhall distinctly just stood real tall and looked the doctor straight in the eyes, and he said, Doctor, seriously, you know, he said, tell me, is there anything greater, or could be greater, than to be a mother of mothers in Israel? And those are very thought-provoking words, and I know that, of course, Mother had 9 girls. She also had 2 boys. Mother was always their ideal, and I think, generally speaking, of course, we lost 1 as a child and 3 since then, but the 8 girls all grew up and were all married in the temple, and all really became what you might call, desired anyway, to be what you call true mothers in Israel. But that was typical of Grandpa Brimhall. I know everybody loved Grandpa Brimhall. He was so in demand just to give talks or write lessons, and when he was president of BYU. I can remember I was his private secretary for maybe a year and a half. That was a great experience. I was very close to Grandpa Brimhall at that time. Always close to my Holbrook grandparents. Let me just mention, I think it should be on record too, that when we had the Third War dedicated, when was that, Grandpa?
1936.
36, yeah. President Grant came up to dedicate it. I was the organist. I used to do a lot of that. I was the organist in the ward. Of course, it was a huge crowd and everyone was so excited. But just before the big meeting started, President Grant walked over to where I was playing the prelude music, and he said, "I'd like to sing a solo during this meeting." And of course, he often did that. He'd tell the little story about how he learned to sing, and he'd sing this solo. And he says, "And you accompany me," and told me what he was going to sing. Well, that's fine, I knew it, But then he started back to sit down, and he turned around. He says, "Oh, by the way, it's too high, so I want you to transpose it down 2 tones." And while I did a lot of playing, I'd never had any technical training, and I didn't know how to do that. And I remember sitting through that meeting. I never enjoyed a meeting, wondering what I was going to do, because I really didn't know how to transpose it down 2 tones. But I guess in a way I was blessed. I don't know what the others. I had to sacrifice for it because the meeting was so involved that he decided not to do the song. So I was safe. But after the meeting, I walked to him and told him that I was the granddaughter of Lafayette Holbrook and Angelina Tingey Holbrook. And I knew that he knew them because I met him a time or two and his wife and visiting in their home. I remember he took hold of me and just looked at me, and I remember distinctly I felt, I guess it's because he's a prophet of God, he's looking right through me. He sees everything about me, whether everything I'm saying or thinking, whether it's exactly right. I just had that feeling. But I remember he said, "Why, your grandmother was the noblest among the noble of women." And I thought that was a sweet tribute for her.
Do you remember your Grandma Brimhall at all? Do you have any?
My grandfather's, I never did know my mother's mother at all. But Flora, as we called her, Grandfather Brimhall's second wife, whom he loved very much, and they had 9 children. I was never very close to her. Mother was very loyal and true to her, and I knew some of her children somewhat. No, we just never were very, very close at all. That's about all I can tell you that. She was a very attractive lady and loved by her children very much.
I remember your Grandpa Holbrook. I guess in those days, in 1930, this was an unusual gift, but it surely was the biggest one that we received. He gave us a check for $50. I remember that.
For your wedding.
For our wedding, yeah. And Grandpa Brimhall spoke. We had a kind of a little program, and Grandpa Brimhall spoke, and President B.H. Roberts was there, and he spoke. And I hadn't really realized until I read a little more about their working together. They were in the mutual work together for years.
Mm-hmm.
But they were speakers, and of course I knew Grandpa Brimhall as a speaker and as a leader and as a great BYU president and one who had faith and vision in the BYU. But I'd like to just mention something about Harold R. Clark, 2 things that I remember about that had to do with, one of them had to do with your father, and the other one had to do with your father, Nancy. And it's interesting, I actually had a different time, but the same type of experience, just walking along the campus of the BYU. And this first one about Grandpa Holbrook, that was Jennie's father, Brother Clark said, you know, I've been wondering, what does your wife's father do for a living? And I said, I don't really know. And he says, well, I'll tell you this. I've watched him. He has time to attend all the athletic events. He has time to go to all the theaters and the Lyceum numbers at the BYU. And he has time with his family. And he goes fishing and hunting.
Remember, he takes Grandma to welcome all the grandchildren.
And he says, I don't know and I don't need to know what he does, but I'd like to have that kind of occupation. And of course that reminds me of the story that Elaine was asked in the school to just write down her father's occupation.
That was my baby sister.
And she wrote down tourist. And when Grandpa heard about it, he says, with all of our grandchildren being welcomed by Sina,
That's his wife.
and I have to take her and get her back, it's almost made a tourist out of me. Well, now the other thing about Harold R. Clark, your father, John, was one of his students, but he used to
In the
teach.
field of business.
He used to be asked by Brother Clark to teach his class often, and Brother Clark had a position as head of the Lyceum and the programs that came to the Y, the entertainers, and it seemed like he was busy with that often, and he would have John teach his classes, and John told me that he really had to study extra hard, and he appreciated that he got much more out of the classes because he had to not only be prepared, but he had to be prepared to answer questions and be prepared to really be the teacher. And he explained that to me, and so I said to Brother Clark when I met him one day, you know, I appreciate your interest in having John help, and I guess you've been so busy with other things that there's been a lot of times when he's had the opportunity to teach your classes. And I remember that he had a little peculiar look. He kind of looked as though he was not looking right at you, but looking up. And I remember, and he says, Brother Groberg, I don't have to be away as much as I've been away, but I think John does a better job of teaching than I would, so I just turn it over to him.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the same Harold R. Clark, the bookstore and the Harold R. Clark building there is named after him.
It used to be the bookstore.
And your father has told me that he was really quite a remarkable man in his experience, that he had real successful business experience. But that was his statement, that he just found out that John could do a better job. So he just let him do it. Well, just a little bit about my grandparents. When they were all gone when Mama and I met, so she never met any of them, and they never got to meet her. But that's who I really had as my best friends, was grandparents. Grandma Brunt was a widow. Her grandpa had died when even Mother was just a little tiny girl. And but Grandma was really a good friend and close, and really had a great influence on our lives. She really raised my sister Maud from the time she was born till she was grown, married. And we used to visit back and forth, even though we didn't live right there all the time. But she knew all the pioneers and all the leaders in the area here, and she made it a point to see that I got acquainted with them. I remember this one experience, and I told about it in the temple book that is just being published. That she just stopped me one day when I was walking with her, and an older man was right there, came up to greet her and to walk with her. She says, "Delbert, I want you to meet and remember Patriarch Robert L. Bybee, because you may never meet in this life another man or person who was with the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo." And I appreciated that, because I don't suppose I ever did meet anyone else. And then her friends were the Steeles, Brother James E. Steele. In fact, Grandmother was on her way up here with the little family, and they camped around Fort Hall, or around Pocatello, really, in 1885. And Brother Steele and some of his family were camped right there, but they were going south, and Grandma and her family were coming north. And they met, and Uncle George and some of them told a story about Brother Steele giving them some bread. They were really traveling, and had traveled from Salt Lake up this way. And he asked, Brother Steele asked where they were going, and they said, well, they had thought of going over to Goose Creek, which was west over by Malta, or over in that area of Idaho. And Uncle George says that Brother Steele says, well, I've been up at Eagle Rock, and there's opportunity there for someone, and I guess they mentioned that here he had two boys and a young family, and that wanted to have a place where they could work and do something. He said, I think there's real opportunity up there. And as they left, of course, Brother Steele and his family went south, going back to get more supplies, and definitely were coming back. And Grandma and Grandpa and the children started out, and then they had to make a decision at the crossroads whether to go west over to Goose Creek or to come on north up to Eagle Rock and Idaho Falls, what became Idaho Falls. And Opal told me the story that her mother and father kind of understood, that they just paused a moment of silence and supplication,
Out of the car,
and looked both ways and decided to come up this way. And they became real close friends of the Steeles. The Steeles came back.
Don't you want to just mention that part, Daddy? The Grandma front, the way Mom told me, I said, well, we have to know. And she left the family, and went a ways away, and prayed, and then came back and says, we're to go to Eagle Rock. Haven't you heard that part?
Yeah, that's in the it was a matter of prayer, and she had such faith in the Lord, and that if they do what He wanted them to do, they'd be all right. And the Steeles became real close friends, and they became friends of mine. That is, Grandma's friends were my friends, and she saw to it that I met her friends, and I appreciated them, and it just gave me, and most of them were a generation older than Grandma, and she was 2 generations older than me, so I really got acquainted with lots of generations. And here just last year, I had a young girl in our ward here that asked me if I'd perform the marriage in the temple for her and her husband to be married. And one of the things that she says, I understand that you were a good friend of my grandmother's grandfather.
And that's what it was.
And that was this Robert L. Bybee, was her grandmother's grandfather. And then my grandparents at Ogden, Grandma and Grandpa Groberg, they were really my real true friends there. And I've often thought that this extended family and having grandparents and having uncles and aunts and having cousins was really a great blessing and a great strength. And I guess I just started out knowing and depending and understanding the importance of the extended family here. And also I felt real close to my parents, who had gone into the spirit world before I hardly remembered them. Mother died when I was 2 and father when I was 3, but my grandparents and my uncles and aunts all just were so close, and yet still they were so sure that they, especially the grandparents and the aunts and uncles that knew Mother and Father, to tell me about them and keep me aware that I was a son of John Enoch Groberg and Maud Brunt Groberg, and having me introduced so often to friends of theirs that knew them, be sure that I was kept in remembrance of them. Well, that's a lot about grandparents.
But I'd like to add one other little thing, Nancy, if I may. I look forward to meeting these grandparents too. I never did, as he said, I never did meet them. But I'd like to just put on the record that my first experience at General Conference, my grandmother Holbrook lived very close to the tabernacle, and she invited me to go with her. I was just a child, and she wanted me to get a good look at the prophet, who at that time was Joseph F. Smith. And I was so excited about this, to go with Grandma and actually see the prophet of God. You know, I was in Salt Lake. And I remember so well, Grandma, we made me up all pretty, you know, with the hair and all. We walked down to General Conference. And the thing I remember about it, when she pointed out the prophet, you know, sitting up there, how shocked I was that he looked just like a man. I was just a little child, you know. I expected something, a big glow about him or something, you know, all dressed in white or something like that. But I remember that was my experience. And then I remember, and I'd like this too, we knew that my grandmother Holbrook was old and ailing. And the last time I saw her, but I had no idea it would be the last time, when she said, I called on her in her home in Salt Lake, 174 East South Temple, see, just shortly below where the church offices are. And when she said goodbye to me, she took me in her arms and she says, oh, you're so wonderful. I love you. I love you. I love you. Kissed me, you know. And I thought, that's almost like a farewell. But at the time, we expected to live a year or so. But it was the last time I saw her, and she died not long after that. And I remember at that time, I think it was that time, I traveled by train, which was common in those days, that I called a cab, or I went to call a cab in their home to take me to the train depot. And when my grandfather heard I was going to get in a taxi to go to the depot, he refused to let me do it because he didn't trust me to any cab driver. And he carried that big heavy suitcase several blocks. And I remember that. That was just typical of him. But it was kind of hard on me because he too was elderly. And he wasn't really well enough to do that. It was quite a distance. And I remember I thought, oh, he's so sweet and so loving and kind. But
Okay. Why don't you tell us some about the laundry days when you were growing up?
Well, out on the farm in Far West, when I was a young fellow, Monday was wash day.
everywhere, Grandpa.
And it sure was real there. And it wasn't just turning on a switch. We used to get up early in the morning and make a big fire in a laundry stove. We had a special stove that was a laundry stove that had a reservoir for heating water, and then it also had a surface where we could put boilers, big boilers to heat water. Then we'd prime the pump outside and get the water coming, and then pump the pump, and every stroke we'd get a little water. We'd have a bucket on the spout, and we'd carry that bucket of water from the well to the stove and pour it in, fill the reservoir, and we'd fill those big boilers on top of the stove. That would be the starting. Then we'd take the
Bucket after bucket after
bucket. Bucket after bucket, that's right. And then we'd take the boiler water and pour it in the washing machine. The washing machine was not a machine like we have now. It had a agitator that worked by hand, and we would just fill the washing machine with water and put in the soap. And by the way, we used to make the soap. We used to make soap, and we would cut it up into kind of like you cut cheese almost into pieces, and then we'd put the clothes in the water in the washing machine, and then turn the washing machine, the agitator, by hand. And as we got the suds and the clothes all through one operation, then we'd take the clothes out and drain the water out in the buckets out of the washing machine, carry the buckets out outside, and then we would fill up the washing machine again with rinse water, and we would go through the process again, getting the soap out of the clothes. And then the final operation of the washing was running the clothes through a wringer, and that was done by hand. We would wind the little handle, and it was a kind of a crank, and that would turn the wringer, and the wringer would wring out the water, and we'd put it into a basket, and then the basket of clothes would be taken out and hung on the line. And
Would
then,
you hang them on the line in the winter time too?
Yeah, I'll say they'd freeze. Winter time, in the summertime they'd lie in the breeze. But
Well, your whole family then was kind of, had plenty to do on wash day, right?
it was a big day, and we would really all work, and
Were there any complainings?
well, you know, we used
Take it
to
for granted.
kind of sing about Monday's wash day, and Aunt Mattie, of course, she was the chief engineer of this. She had all the responsibility of it, and she seemed to be so happy about it, and we were happy, although it was a lot of work doing all the things. I guess we did other things on that day. That is, she had to have meals, and we had to have other work, but the big thing was wash day.
Once a week, every
Yeah,
Monday.
every Monday.
Grandpa, you didn't have water in the house until quite a while, right?
Oh no, we never did have water in the house there at that original farm. The first water that they had in the house, I believe the first was when they built the little house.
You really got
And you and I arranged to have, well, they may have had cold water, but they didn't have all the plumbing and the bathroom fixtures and that, because we helped with that after we were married. But it was, of course, they didn't even have, when I first remember, we didn't have electricity. There wasn't any electricity. Our lights were coil oil lamps, and no electricity, and we didn't have telephones. I remember when the first telephone came, that was quite a thing.
Well, that was exciting.
And when the electricity came, that was quite a thing. And as I say, we never did have plumbing in the house while I was there. It was really kind of the pioneering.
With that sweet Aunt Mattie of yours, I've never heard a word of complaint about any of it and all these children, and she'd always find time to do genealogy work. I wish you could have known her. She was a beautiful person to look at, and a beautiful spirit, just an amazing person. But it wasn't easy.
But she never gave any indication that she thought it was hard. She did, just as I say, we actually learned to sing. There was a song that Monday, wash day, Tuesday, ironing day, and that was just the way it went, and we were all happy about it.
How about wash day in your home, Grandma?
Shall I tell that before I talk about the clothes, what we wore?
Why don't you?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a family-involved affair, too. It was always Monday, and it was a little different, though. Our home was, we did have electricity, and we had water in the house, and it was quite a big home, that clinker brick house in Provo. But I can remember, we also had, I'm trying to figure out why we always had a big boiler, boiling water on the stove. What would we do with it? We had an electric washing machine. But what I do remember is that I got to hang out many times. We had a pulley that went from the house clear out to the barn. So we'd hang these clothes with the clothesline and do something, and then move on down. and there'd just be 2 or 3 lines. And there'd be, with all these little girls, we all wore black bloomers. Do you know what black bloomers are? Do you know what bloomers are? They're kind of full pants, underpants, black, always black, is that true? And shirts and socks. We'd have black socks to go with our little tie shoes. And there'd be, 2 or 3 pairs for all the girls. Mother had 9 daughters, but they weren't all little of them. Hanging out all those clothes and bringing them all in, if we wash the sheets and things, we have to fill 2 or 3 times. And like you say, in the winter they'd freeze them. What did we do? We didn't bring them in frozen, or maybe we did. Can't remember. But I remember that we had a big kitchen. And Mother had a gas range where she did most of her cooking. But we also had a coal range. And that's what we used on wash day with this boiler. I should be able to remember what. Did we boil the clothes?
That probably was
I think we boiled some of the clothes. Sterilize them or something. Yes,
And Carol, we boiled the white.
yes, I think so, to make them whiter. Yes. But I remember the boiler would be on the coal stove, cold water, and right next to us, every Monday we'd have beans. They'd soak overnight, and then they'd be boiling there, for dinner and even for supper. And then on the cooler part of the stove, we'd always have clabber milk. The cream would be taken off to be turned into butter. And then we'd always, that clabber milk, some magic way, would turn into cottage cheese, and we loved that homemade cottage cheese. So those 3 degrees of heat, the hottest, for the boiling water, and the next for the beans, and the next just for the clabber milk. But I can remember wash day.